But please welcome Warren Epstein.
What if? It's an interesting theme, and I was thinking about that. What if a man could turn into a woman? And a woman could turn into a man? In the 1960s, that was science fiction. But there was this guy, Stanley Biber, and of all the people I've met while I was during my career in newspapers, I don't think there's anybody who embodied that sense of innovation, of being on the frontier in a way, as this guy who really turned Trinidad, Colorado into the sex change capital of the world. And it also led to one of the most embarrassing moments of my journalistic career, but more on that later. Stanley was an army surgeon during Korea, and afterwards was looking for a place to settle down. He heard that this little town in Colorado, in Trinidad, was looking for a surgeon, so he went there. He wasn't the first person to perform a sex change operation or a sexual reassignment, gender reassignment surgery. That belonged to a doctor in Johns Hopkins in Baltimore. And that was 1969, and shortly after that first one, Dr. Biber, who was working as a surgeon in Trinidad, had the social worker come up to him and said, "I've heard about this procedure, I want you to perform it on me." And Stanley was this amazing intellect. He just loved the challenge of that idea. And he thought, I think I could do that. But how do you do that? Well, he contacts the doctor at Johns Hopkins, and he has him fax him the surgical plans. Now, if anybody remembers what faxes were like in 1969, I mean, you need 5 guys just to hold it down so it doesn't all curl up while you're trying to do the surgery. And is that a 2 or a 4? He is literally performing this surgery with this diagram that's cutting by the numbers. You talk about brave pioneers, the first person who went on his table doing that. He performed that surgery successfully, and he had meant to be have this quiet little practice in Trinidad, but after that it didn't stay quiet for long, and soon word got around the world that he was performing these surgeries, and soon he was performing 3, 4, 5 a day, and it was a part of the economic engine of the town of Trinidad, this one man doing these surgeries. And Johns Hopkins eventually got out of the sexual reassignment surgery. Their feeling was that these people would be better served by therapy than by a scalpel. And Stanley's thing was, that's rather judgmental tone. I feel like patients should decide what they want. And he was an interesting guy. Not quite what I expected when I went to do the story. I don't know if I was expecting like some flamboyant San Francisco hairdresser type or what, but he had this big old cowboy hat. He was this down-home Colorado guy. He reminded me like a cross between Marcus Welby and Andy Griffith. And this is the guy who's the sexual capital of the world. It didn't quite fit for me. Anyway, I'm on my way to do this assignment, and he calls me and says, "Oh, Warren, I'm so glad you're coming to do this. By the way, would you like to actually witness one of the surgeries and sit in with me?" Yes. I had, during my journalism career, I had seen some procedures, and I'd actually sat through an autopsy. But there's something about this kind of surgery that, if you're not in the market for it, brings up certain primal fears. And I remember thinking my first introduction to the idea of surgery, I forgot my wrist, thankfully, but sort of like your introduction to that whole concept. But I remember my brother was getting tonsillectomy. He was getting his tonsils removed, but my parents were afraid to tell him the truth, that we're going to the doctor and doing so. So they tell him, and this apparently was a common practice, David, we're going to a pajama party. And he's all excited, he's got pajamas on, take him to the hospital, knock him out, he wakes up, tonsils are gone. So I was thinking about that idea. So I got to Trinidad, and how many of you guys have been to Trinidad? Just about, yeah. Oh, it's a beautiful town, isn't it? You know, it's just a classic Colorado mining town that's now got some cute B&Bs and antique shops and cafes, and Stanley, in a large part, was responsible for how lovely it is, because one of the things when people are going to get sexual reassignment surgery, they have to be in therapy for a certain amount of time, they have to live as the other gender for a certain amount of time, and his rule was you had to stay a week in Trinidad, which, of course, the chamber loved, because it really boosted their tourism. Everybody that comes in, they have to stay there for a week. And I asked, you know, while I was down there in Trinidad, I asked some of the old-timers and the ranchers, you know, how do you feel to have these transsexuals coming through? And they just said, oh, they're delightful, they're so kind, and they tip well. I mean, this is you know, this lunch bucket kind of, you know. Anyway, I was very impressed by Trinidad. And so I got to meet Viber, and he said, oh, the first thing he says to me is, you ready to scrub in? I was like, I was hoping for a little bit of foreplay or whatever, but going right to it, okay. So he's got it going, and I said, is this going to be male to female or female to male? He does both. And he says, neither. Is there a new flavor? This is actually going to be a female to female. It's actually an update. And as he starts the surgery, he explains to me that this is a surgery I did back in 1986. And, you know, we weren't that great at it back then. But now, I mean, by the time I'm done, this vagina is going to have a clitoris and labia, and it's just going to be a thing of beauty, and her partner would not know the difference. And all the queasiness I had sort of gave way to this sense of wonder of what this amazingly gifted surgeon was able to do. And after the surgery, he invited me back to his ranch where I met his lovely wife, and he had this spread with horses, and his kids were already gone, but he talked about them incessantly. And I was thinking about how I'd read stories about him that all sort of hinted at the idea of how normal he was for a guy who did this kind of thing. And I thought, you know, they're not quite getting it. There's something about this man that is not normal, that is really far from the norm, and I couldn't figure it out right away. But then the next day, I did. He wanted to show me what a female to male looked like. So he invites me to one of these little surgical waiting rooms that he had. And in there is this very tall Filipino transsexual. And he says, oh, Joe, would you take off, he's just wearing a towel. Joe, would you take off the towel and show me your penis? That's not a line I hear very often. And then he starts critiquing the work. And he says, you know, look at it, it's just not where we want to be. It doesn't have the definition. I mean, it's sort of the suggestion of a penis, and it works, but it's not what... And what do you say to that? I mean, I want to... Yeah, that's a pretty ugly salami guy. I mean, I don't know what to say other than I really want to just die at that moment. And I'm hoping, please God, please put the towel on, and I'm looking at my shoes, and when I look up, I see him grinning at me, and Stanley, and I realize that the thing that is not normal about this guy, that's really unusual, is he has no sense of embarrassment or awkwardness about sexuality in a way that even people undergoing these procedures wouldn't think have something, but he didn't. And that combined with his surgical genius made him the perfect person to take on this role. He worried for a while about whether he'd have a replacement, and then he did. He retired about 3 years after I did the interview with him, and then he did get a successor, this woman who's keeping it going, and it's still the sex change capital of the world. And he died a couple of years later. Quite an extraordinary man. And I remember after I wrote the story, which talked about all he'd done for this town of Trinidad and what it meant for him, and I swear I had this dream that night that my mother told me we were going to a pajama party.